James had worked tirelessly for his dream home, a charming house with a large backyard, free from the absurd regulations of an HOA. Unlike most of his neighbors, he'd chosen not to join the HOA when he purchased the property, assuming that would keep them out of his business. He was mistaken. The trouble began when Susan, the HOA president, showed up at his door. Dressed in her typical jogging outfit, clutching a clipboard, she skipped the small talk. "We need to discuss your backyard," she said, peering over his fence as if it were her own. James raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "It's supposed to be a community green space," she announced, as if it were common knowledge. The previous owner knew it was meant to be a public park for the neighborhood. James stared at her, then glanced at his yard, his private property, fully fenced, maintained with his own effort and money. "That's odd," he said, "because my deed says it's mine." Susan's smile wavered. "Technically, yes, but it's always been treated as open space. Kids play there, families picnic, it's tradition." "Tradition doesn't trump property law," James replied, irritation creeping in. Susan didn't budge. "I'm informing you that we'll be adding it to the HOA's community maintenance plan. We expect you to keep it accessible at all times." James crossed his arms. "Not happening." Susan's face tightened. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. If you refuse, I'll have to issue fines for blocking community access." James nearly laughed. "I'm not in your HOA. You can't find me." Susan's nostrils flared. She stormed off, muttering about selfish homeowners. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A few days later, James's backyard wasn't so private anymore. Kids climbed his fence, running across his lawn like it was a playground. Parents set up picnics on his grass. One couple even put up a soccer goal. James confronted them, but they smugly pointed towards Susan's house. "She said it's a community park," one woman said, barely glancing up from her phone. "You can't just hog it." James was furious. He asked them to leave, but they ignored him. Then came the petty retaliation. Someone cut a hole in his fence. The next morning, his lawn was littered with trash. When he complained, Susan smiled sweetly. "That's just the cost of having a park," she said. "Maybe you should clean up after your guests." James clenched his jaw. Susan wanted a park? Fine. He'd give her a park she'd never forget. Susan wasn't one to back down. If she couldn't force James to comply, she'd find another way to get her way. But, like everything else she tried, it backfired spectacularly. Her first move was a neighborhood cleanup day. She rallied the HOA members, convincing them they could restore the park to its former glory. Armed with shovels, rakes, and an absurd sense of entitlement, they marched into James's backyard to reclaim their precious green space. They regretted it instantly. The first step onto the yard was a disaster. Shoes sank deep into mud. Every step pulled them deeper. One man lost a shoe entirely and had to hobble back to solid ground, covered in thick sludge. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, biting any exposed skin until the volunteers looked like they'd broken out in a rash. Then chaos erupted. Someone spotted a snake, just a harmless water snake, but it didn't matter. Within seconds, the cleanup crew was in full panic. People screamed, shoved each other, and tripped over themselves to escape the so-called park. Susan refused to give up. She stood at the edge of the yard, barking orders at the fleeing HOA members. "Get back in there. We have to fix this." No one listened. They were done. Defeated but stubborn, Susan tried legal threats next. She filed a complaint with the city, claiming James had destroyed community land and created a health hazard. An inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, ready to shut James down. But instead of finding violations, the inspector was impressed. "This is actually a fantastic natural wetland," he told Susan, admiring the thriving reeds and cattails. "You're lucky to have it." Susan's jaw dropped. "Lucky? Absolutely," the inspector continued. "These ecosystems support biodiversity. I'd recommend leaving it as ice. It might even qualify for environmental funding." James bit back a grin as Susan turned a furious shade of red. The final blow came at the HOA meeting. Susan demanded action, pushing for aggressive legal measures to force James to restore the lawn. But after the swamp debacle, the other members were fed up. "We can't find him's not in the HOA," one said. "He's not breaking any laws. We just made fools of ourselves trying to clean it up." For the first time, Susan was outnumbered. The people who once followed her blindly were turning against her. Then came the ultimate humiliation. Instead of punishing James, the HOA board fined Susan for unauthorized activity on private property. James didn't even have to say a word. The look on her face was victory enough.